what do you think, where do you think we can go from here? Okay, ask the client. A lot of times people do need to go away for long periods of time. Our programs are long. They can be up to 18 months long. Okay, 12 months is a period of time you can have, but those programs have humongous waiting lists. You know, you can cobble together something if you like. You can cobble together programs, and you can put people into it. And sometimes it's just, there's just not enough to hold people in place. And I know we should all be hopeful, and I know we should all look at it. And I will struggle as much as the client to get the client what they need and to try to get the client where I want them to be. Because while I'm detached, I'm also, you know, there's this, I don't know how to describe it, but you know, I'm also attached to them in a way. I'm just not going to feel responsible for their choices, but I will work with them as hard as I can. But I will understand that as much as I can put out over there, that will be their choice. And that I will have done my best. Because at the end of the day, I have to look and see, did I do the best? Did I do what was right? And that's a time when you look at it and you try to work with families that way. But, you know, life is not always happy endings.
Yes. I don't know. I've heard things, and you know, people are described as functioning alcoholics, yes, or functioning abusers. Yes. What would you say to that characterization of a person?
Those functioning alcoholics are the ones who go home in the evening and they drink and they drink and they drink and they drink and they drink, and they get drunk and they go to sleep, and they wake up in the morning and they may have a little drink or maybe not. They'll go to work and they're waiting for the drink later in the day. That's your functional alcoholic. They get bent out of shape if they cannot drink. These are the ones who will not go to a party if there's no alcohol. If there's a choice between going to a party where there's alcohol and there's a party where there isn't alcohol, they're the ones who've drunk so much that the next morning there's still enough alcohol in their system to keep them going till the 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock when they can get off and drink again. I had a guy who had alcohol in his car. I was young and I was stupid. I didn't know any better. And this man would run down to the car and come back. What did I know? I was stupid, you know. But I learned. I don't miss that again. I had another one who was working on an amphibious kind of thingamajiggy, and he had alcohol in his car. At lunchtime, he'd go down and drink, and then he'd come to treatment. I could breathalyze him, and he told me. We knew where he was. We sent him away to residential treatment. But you know, he was drinking all the time. That's functioning alcoholic, when they drink all the time.
And do those families usually then still have that setup with the the quote-unquote functioning alcoholic?
Some, you know, they are the if it's a male, and there's all kinds of stuff. If it's a male, then there is, you know, the family income coming in often enough from them. They're contributing to the home. If it's a female, she's contributing, and you know, with the income. A lot of times, women, if they're functioning and they're home, and this sounds very 50s, but it happens even now. Women, first of all, don't make it into treatment as much as men do. Okay, even nowadays, if you go to any treatment facility, if you have 10% women being treated, or 20%, you're doing well. You're doing really well. But that's really part of it, where you look at it, and the families will go with the program because it's fitting a need for them. You know, it's filling a need. It may be filling a need for the other spouse to feel powerful, to feel in control, you know, if you will. But those are the psychological, emotional pieces coming into play. They don't want to rock the boat.
Tonight we're going to be talking about poverty. It's good to see you all again. I really enjoyed working with you on Saturday, and tonight we're going to be discussing another topic that is sensitive. So I'm going to ask you to be open-minded, be soft-hearted. We're coming in here with different life experiences. Once again, some of us have experienced poverty. Some of us have experiences with poverty. Some of us have lived in the middle or upper class for the majority of our lives. So I'm hoping that we can learn from each other and I'm hoping that we can be open with each other and a little bit vulnerable tonight. So I did have a PowerPoint presentation. It's not going to be up here, but it is in front of you. And I'm going to be using your binder tonight, Chapter 5, and I believe that it starts, I don't know if it's Unit 2 or Unit 3, but I'm going to let you go ahead and flip there. I think it starts on page 15. So Chapter 5, page 15. I'm going to ask you, as future CASA volunteers, to be very self-aware when it comes to the issue of poverty. And I say that because many of you may end up working with children who are in a different socioeconomic class than what you currently are in. And it can change or affect how you perceive a parent's ability to care for a child. So I need you to become more self-aware about how you grew up, how your life experience, how you feel about poverty affects how you treat your CASA family, how you feel about their ability to care for children, how you treat your CASA family. I also need to remind you at the very beginning that we are not rescuers as CASA in the sense that we don't provide direct services. So when you get into these families, and a lot of the families that are involved with CPS are at or below the poverty line, you see that there's a need, you see the child doesn't have computer for homework, you see that the child doesn't have glasses, you see that there's not a bed for both of the children. CASAs have big hearts, that's why you're CASAs, you care. But what you can't do as a CASA is say, you know what, my son he just outgrew that bed, that toddler bed, so I think I'm going to take it over there. You can't do that. You have to work through the social worker and let the social worker know what the needs of the family is. So I'm putting that out right there at the beginning. Let's do an agenda first, and I think the agenda is right on the front page. What we're going to do, and let me get it in front of me as well, we're going to be talking about the facts about poverty first. We're also going to be talking about the types of poverty. We're going to do a couple of group activities today, and then I'm going to wrap it up by talking about programs that are in the state of Virginia for families that need assistance. And the last activity I think will be a lot of fun. The last activity is going to take about 20 minutes of our time, so I'm going to be flying through some things today and going pretty quickly. But facts about poverty. Let's just talk about what poverty is. Can anyone give just a definition of what you think poverty is? What is poverty? Okay, I'll tell you. Okay.
I guess when your income, whatever it may be, is not sufficient to provide the basic requirements of
Okay.
food, shelter.
Okay. Thank you for volunteering to stand up and say something about that. You're exactly right. That is part of it. It's the condition or the situation where you have little or no money, goods, or means of support. And a really simple way of saying that is that poverty is a lack of resources. And that's how I'm going to use that term today. It's a lack of resources. Because just because you don't have money doesn't mean that you can't make it, or you can't keep your head above water, or you can't survive. People who are in poverty, especially those who have been in poverty for several generations, are actually quite resourceful. So just because someone doesn't have money doesn't mean that they can't provide for their family, provide for their children, and be successful in the world. So just want to say that up front. Now, poverty is not, I said what it is not child abuse. It is a risk factor. There are many things and many challenges that families that are in poverty come against because of that situation. Because of the stress, they may use substances. They may have mental health issues. They may feel anxiety. So it's definitely a risk factor, but it in itself is not abuse. It is not abuse. Okay, I like to this early in this conversation do a quiz with everybody that I'm talking to. Because there are a lot of myths about poverty, so I want to dispel those at the very beginning. And right away I'm going to ask you to be vulnerable because I want you to be honest when I ask you these true or false questions, okay? So I've got about 6 questions here for you. The first one being, and these are true or false except for 2 of them. Most of the poor are single mothers and their children. Raise your hand if you think that that is true. Most of the poor are single mothers and their children. Okay, so about 1/4 of the class thinks that. They are more likely to be in poverty, but the fact is that that is false. That just as many 2-parent households are in poverty as households where there is a single parent. Okay, so that is a myth. Number 2, those in poverty live off of government welfare. How many of you think that that is true? those in poverty live off of government welfare. Okay? It's false. Most of those who live in poverty are not using welfare. I think that it makes up about 25% of the income of those who are on poverty, welfare assistance. The majority of those living in poverty are Caucasian. True? Okay, over half the class is saying true. That is true. 48% of those living in poverty are white. I'd like to say, though, that the poverty rates for African Americans, Hispanics, and other minority groups are actually higher. So once again, we're seeing that disproportionality that we see in foster care, that we see in the jail system. We're seeing the same thing when it comes to poverty. Which place has consistently higher rates of poverty? Urban or rural? Which place? I'll go urban first. How many people think that urban poverty is more, happens more often? Okay. Okay. It's actually rural. There are higher rates of poverty in rural areas. And it's unfortunate because usually people's perception is it's urban and, you know, it's this inner city and there's all this poverty. And the thing is that people who are in rural areas tend to have to live with family members. They tend to have to maybe be at a campground, live in an abandoned house, rely on that good old boy network, that sort of thing. Whereas in more populated areas, there really might be more shelters and things available. Okay, anti-poverty programs are designed to reduce poverty. True? Raise your hand if you think it's true. Are designed to reduce poverty. Okay, it's false. It's false. And they weren't originally designed to reduce poverty. They were kind of designed by the federal government as a safety net. So some people complain, and there's been a lot of welfare reform. It happened in the state of Virginia. But people say, why in the world, you know, the federal government, these programs? Okay, well, they weren't designed to get people out of poverty. They were just designed as kind of a Band-Aid approach. So now there's been some welfare reform. And the last thing I'm going to ask is, poor families are trapped in a cycle of poverty that few escape. True? How many people think that's true? Okay, about half the room. That's actually false. Okay, most of the time when people are in poverty, it's temporary, usually less than a few years. So I know that's a little dry, but I like to put that out there at the beginning because sometimes we have these perceptions of poverty and they're not true. So I like to put them out there at the very beginning. All right. But first, we're going to talk about situational versus generational poverty. There are two types of poverty, situational poverty and generational poverty. Situational poverty is actually quite common, and it happens because of an event. It might be an event like a chronic illness, divorce, incarceration. So this sudden event happens, it changes the ability of people to be able to provide for the family, and then they end up in poverty. That's actually quite common. Think of Hurricane Katrina even. That was a situation. And when you're thinking about being a CASA, think about a situation where a family, a mother is staying at home and a father is working full-time, and come to find out he's sexually abusing one of the children. Let's say he's sexually abusing a daughter. He ends up getting criminally charged. Mom has not been working. She hasn't worked in years. Dad gets thrown in jail. What happens to that family? Situational poverty. Now we're in a situation where we're in a crisis, whereas before they were able to survive. And because child abuse happened, now they're in poverty. So that is situational poverty that some of your families may find themselves in. The second type of poverty is generational poverty. And that's poverty that has occurred for 2 generations or more. So that's a standard that we use for something to be generational poverty. And these families can be quite resourceful, actually. Remember when I said that money isn't the only thing that means that a person is in poverty if they don't have money? If people have been in poverty for generations, they probably know where the free clinics are. They may know where they can get resources for their family, such as food. Also, maybe they have a really strong support network. Maybe they have a large family. Maybe they have a church family. Maybe there are they've learned to survive. So for generations, they've survived. Now, there is a segment of that population that is kind of hopeless and feels like the world is against them and there's no way to make it out. And I have to say that living in American culture, it's pretty easy to see how that happens because there's so much focus on materialism here, making the money, being this big and great thing in our society. So you can see how some people just feel absolutely hopeless when they see that so many people have so much and they have so little. So that is part of that population too. But many of the people that are in generational poverty work, the majority of them work. And they work for minimum wage, so they have less access to benefits and health care. And I mean, what can you say about that? You hear a lot of the time, well, they just live off of welfare. They just have more babies. They just do this. They just do that. That is absolutely not true. People are working and they're working hard. And you heard, I said 2/3 of the people in poverty that they talked to in Fairfax County were working. Now we're going to talk about an activity. In your book on page 15, I believe it is, or is it, sorry, it's 16. I apologize. It's 16. There's an activity called Why Are Poor Children More Likely to Be in the System? Did everybody get the opportunity to read through this? Okay. What I want you to do is break into groups of 4. And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to count you off in 4s. I'm going to have you count off in 4s, and we're going to do what we did on Saturday, where I'm just going to have you go into 4 sections of the room. So let's start on this side this time. Okay. Number 5, you're going to go with the 4s. How about that? I want the 1s to come over here in this area. So one person have a binder with you in group 1 and come over here, right over here. I want 2 back behind in the, I guess it would be your left. Yep, so go with her. Number 2, go with the person with their hand raised. Number 3's back there in the corner right near Rebecca. And just, I'm going to talk as you're getting your group together. We are still filming, so here's how we're going to do this. I'm going to give each of you one of the questions that's on page 16. And I want you to discuss it for a couple of minutes. And then what I'm going to have you do is nominate a very brave group person to come up here and share what your group has brainstormed about an answer to the question that you're going to be asked, okay? So let me give you your questions. Group 1, this is the question that I want you to think over. What effect might living in poverty have on access to education, health care, and daycare? That's your question. Group number 2, I bet you can guess. What effect might current poverty have on the likelihood of future poverty? Group number 3, is poverty viewed differently in different communities, geographic regions, neighborhoods, and or religions? Why or why not? And finally, group number 4, are the experiences of poor families of color distinct from those of poor white families? What about Native American families? Why are race and income level interconnected issues? So I want you to take about 3 to 5 minutes and have a discussion about that, okay? Direct your attention back to the front, and group number 1 has nominated a very brave volunteer to come talk about the first question. So group number 1, can you come, or person, come and tell us some of the discussion you had about what effect might living in poverty have on access to education, health care, and daycare?
We talked about the biggest problem is probably transportation. Transportation is always going to be difficult. And we especially talked about rural areas because if you live in an urban area, you can catch a bus, you can walk, you can get a metro. But in rural areas, especially with schools and things like that, if you can't catch the bus, you won't have another way to get home. So you can't do any after-school things, and you can't probably be on teams, and it really curtails. You can't go in early, can't get any extra help from your teacher. We think that the barriers to education is probably one of the lowest because everybody's entitled to a free education. Health care, there are ways with a chip and things like that to get health care, but we do note that even in Fairfax County, school quality is going to vacillate depending on which area you live in. So if you're living in McLean, because your property taxes are better and your parents are more involved, you're probably going to have a lot better school than if you're down at Fort Belvoir or one of the other areas where a little bit more rural, more working parents, more immigrants, not going to have as much money or time. Things such as parent-teacher conferences are not going to be able to attend. Daycare, we think, is probably one of the biggest things that will have the effect. There's not as much of support. There are some sliding scales where your working parents can get more inexpensive, but that's an incredible expense for any family. It's an incredible expense for a working poor family or somebody living in poverty. So we think that daycare would really could almost put you into poverty or make you possibly not want to work because it's so expensive to find a place for your child to stay.
Thank you very much. Everybody give her a little round of applause. You're exactly right. Anybody know what the going rate is for daycare, let's say for a month in Fairfax County? About $800. And then you decide, well, you know what? There's this nice woman next door, and I just know that she will watch my 2 children for me. And wouldn't you know, she's not certified, but she's not that expensive, and she's got 10, 12 other kids there. Okay, so as a CASA, that's a problem. Some people get in trouble because they're not taking their children to quality daycare. Well, it's really hard to get children in quality daycare in Fairfax County for an affordable price. So that's a really good point. Okay, group number 2. Group number 2. I'm just going to say the question as you walk up. What effect might current poverty have on the likelihood of future poverty?
Well, we thought this was actually kind of a hard question to answer because situational poverty is probably something that you're in for a short period of time, and then maybe with help and resources you can get out of it. Whereas, what was the other one? Generational would probably, would be perpetuate. Each generation would continue to stay in this, probably mostly for lack of education, lack of motivation, and you do read books periodically about people that have grown up in a tremendously poor home, but they have somehow had the motivation, encouraged to try to break out of it. We also felt like if you're poor, you ought to be in Fairfax County because we seem to have a lot of good services.
We do. Thank you for coming up here and sharing that. Thank you. And there's actually been research done about, you bring up a really good area or a topic in poverty, and that's why is it that some people get out of poverty and why is it that some people stay in poverty? And there's been some research done. And they say that some of the reasons that people get out of poverty is if they have a clear vision or goal to get out of that poverty, if the situation is so painful that they can't take it anymore, so they decide to do something differently in their lives. Also, if they have had a role model or a positive influence in their lives, it can sometimes turn the tide and help that person come out of poverty and make different choices for themselves. If they have a talent or some sort of ability, people have come out of poverty because they're able to do something, and we see that sometimes in sports arenas or writers or some talent. And you even hear children say, well, I'm just going to be a professional basketball player. I'm going to do this and do that. And we say, oh, that'll never happen. For some people, that is actually how they get out of poverty, so don't downplay it too much. Those are their dreams. And then also, being in poverty is rarely about lack of intelligence. A lot of the time can be about just not knowing what resources are available. So people who become aware of those resources, that can be very helpful. Okay, group number 3. Your question was, is poverty viewed differently in different communities, geographic regions, neighborhoods, and or religions? Why or why not? And you sent up the guy who has a hurt foot. What is group number 3 doing? Okay.
We had trouble with this question also. I mean, the main thing that we came up with was a relative factor. So what's considered a family of 4, or maybe in a rural area or so, that may be a pretty good existence or so, but up here in Fairfax County, it's going to be tough for a family of 4. And also we kind of discussed about the support systems that maybe different religions may have or different neighborhoods might have or so that may help people out of poverty versus other areas where the support may not be there. So.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, group 3. All right, and lastly, group 4. Go ahead and send your spokesperson up. Are the experiences of poor families of color distinct from those of poor white families? You have kind of a compound question here. What about Native American families, and why are race and income level interconnected issues? That's about 3 questions in one. Come on up, Carol.
Yeah, well, we kind of just dismissed the Native American because we didn't have much experience
Okay,
talking about that, and we just kind of narrowed it to what we knew
Sure.
about Fairfax
That's
County,
perfectly fine.
not the whole country. But we felt that many of the families of color, Hispanic, Asian, African American, might have some difficulty accessing services in the county because they don't know who to ask. It's a cultural thing. They're ashamed. they can't get out there and find out what they need to know to get services to begin with. And they also might be fighting stereotypes in the job market, getting jobs, discrimination against them. So they're not going to be able to get them, to get jobs. They have but their basic needs across all the families we felt were probably pretty much the same. In other words, if you walked into their homes, they're all going to have problems getting food on the table, because somebody can't work, or they aren't walked into homes where, how things would look differently. They just don't have their basic needs met. And getting financial aid, though, should be the same. If they get to a situation where they can go into an agency to give them financial aid, it's based basically on their financial statement. So we didn't see that would be a big difference. But that's probably not all right. So.
No. We're having discussions here. It's good to get everybody's point of view. And yes, thank you, group number 4. What I would like to bring up also is to kind of piggyback on something that you said, which is if someone has immigrated to this country and they're looking for work, it may be that in their country of origin, they were a professor, a teacher, maybe a political figure. They come to the United States, maybe, English isn't their first language, and maybe they're not here legally. And so sometimes what happens is people get treated in such a way because they don't speak English, and maybe they're doing a job that they never did in their own country, something like janitorial work, or working at a fast food restaurant, or a day laborer. And so I just want you to keep in mind as a CASA volunteer that just because someone can't communicate with you in English, and just because they don't have a job that you consider to be something that you would do to provide for your family, that is no indicator of their intelligence or their ability. Many of our immigrant families are highly educated and have very extremely intelligent individuals. So I want to put that out there as well. But it can be hard to find work and to provide for your family, being here illegally or not being able to speak English. So, all right, thank you for participating in that and being so brave. And at this point, you can go ahead and go back to your chairs. I'm going to talk to you about 2 more things before our last activity. And when you were doing your reading, did everyone understand that a lot of the time families that are involved with the system don't often contact the system for the first time because of child abuse? Was that surprising to anybody? Most of our families that are involved with the system, whether it was for food stamps or whatever, they didn't come to the system. They get involved in the system because they come for something else. For example, their first contact with the system is because they need the TANF, which is the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or they need some sort of service, and they need help being self-sufficient. And so that gets them in contact with the system. Most of our families in poverty don't get in touch with the system first because there's been child abuse.
What surprised me more than that was when it said that when they go to get these services, what they don't understand is they are coming in contact with more mandated.
Exactly.
Do they hold that by any chance, or do they just discover that?
It probably just happens. It probably just happens because, as you mentioned, you contact the system because maybe you need food stamps or some sort of support, and then you get a case manager. So then the case manager is working with your family every so often, every month. So now you're in contact with this mandated reporter. And if you take your children to the ER and